Ever wonder why some Christian texts got benched, left out of the Bible we read today? What secrets did those writings hold? The kind the early church decided to bury for centuries. Tonight, we're digging deep into one of the most explosive documents from early Christianity, the Gospel of Thomas. It's a text that'll flip everything you thought you knew about Jesus' teachings, blowing the lid off the original message of Christianity. Picture this for a second: a lost gospel, packed with Jesus' own words, but words so radically different from what you've heard preached in church that they'd completely reshape your understanding of Christianity. That gospel is real. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. For nearly 1,600 years, it lay buried, literally, in the sands of the Egyptian desert, like time itself was in on the conspiracy to keep these revolutionary teachings under wraps. This ain't just some dusty, forgotten religious text. This document straight up challenges the very bedrock of Christian doctrine as we know it. While the traditional church preaches salvation through faith in Christ as our go-between, the Gospel of Thomas flips the script entirely. It tells us the kingdom of God isn't some distant heaven or far-off future event. It's here, now, inside every single one of us. It says we don't need middlemen, priests, or institutions to connect with the divine, because that divinity is already living within us. So why was this message such a threat to the early church? The answer is simple, yet profound. It cuts out the need for a hierarchical religious structure. If everyone can tap directly into spiritual truth, if the kingdom of God is within us, then what do we need bishops, popes, or religious institutions for, telling us how to get saved? This gospel doesn't just question Christian doctrine. It outright threatens the entire power structure of organized religion. The story of how this gospel even made it to us is wild in itself. It was stumbled upon in 1945 by Egyptian farmers near the town of Nag Hammadi, tucked away with 52 other Gnostic texts that had been hidden for millennia. These documents were carefully preserved in ceramic jars, stashed in desert caves, almost like someone knew a day would come when the world would finally be ready for these censored teachings. When scholars started translating and poring over these texts, they realized they had something extraordinary on their hands. The Gospel of Thomas isn't your grandma's gospel. It doesn't have narratives about Jesus' birth, death, or resurrection. Instead, it lays out 114 sayings, or logia, attributed directly to Jesus, many of which are nowhere to be found in the canonical Gospels. These sayings reveal a spiritual philosophy that radically diverges from traditional Christian theology, leaning more towards a mystical, personal understanding of the divine. The historical backdrop for this gospel is crucial to understanding why it got censored. During the early centuries of Christianity, it was like the Wild West of spiritual thought. There were multiple currents, each with its own take on Jesus' teachings. The Gnostics, often linked with texts like the Gospel of Thomas, believed in a direct, intimate knowledge of the divine, a gnosis, or inner knowing, that didn't need any outside help. This Gnostic perspective was on a head-on collision course with the version of Christianity that eventually became the Church's official doctrine. While ecclesiastical leaders were busy building a centralized hierarchical structure, complete with specific creeds and sacraments controlled by the clergy, these Gnostic texts pushed for an individual, direct spirituality that made all that institutional mediation totally unnecessary. If you're as hooked as I am by these discoveries, the kind that challenge centuries of religious teaching, then you gotta hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're gonna keep on digging into censored texts and hidden truths that have been kept out of the public eye for way too long. Every week we're peeling back more layers of historical secrets that'll totally change your perspective on religion, history, and power. The process of picking which texts made it into the Bible and which ones got cut wasn't some divine-inspired act. It was hardball politics, pure and simple. Back in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine gave Christianity the green light across the Roman Empire, there was a real need to nail down a unified version of the faith, something that could act as social glue and a tool for political control. Texts that boosted ecclesiastical authority and social order. They got the nod. Anything that challenged the hierarchy or pushed for direct access to the divine, systematically scrubbed. Councils like Nicaea and Constantinople, along with other church powwows, didn't just lay down the fundamental Christian doctrines, they also decided which texts were heretical, and therefore dangerous to the stability of the burgeoning church. The Gospel of Thomas, with its focus on inner knowledge and its dismissal of external mediation, had a bullseye on its back. It was exactly the kind of thinking those ecclesiastical leaders wanted to wipe out. One of the most striking differences between the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels is its focus on the now versus the later. Traditional Christianity often pushes salvation as a future event, something that happens after death or at Christ's second coming. But the Gospel of Thomas presents the kingdom of God as a present, accessible reality. Its famous saying 3 declares the kingdom is both in heaven and on earth, but also within us and outside us, hinting at a pantheistic or panentheistic understanding of divinity. That's a game changer. This perspective on the immediacy of the divine kingdom doesn't just challenge traditional Christian eschatology, it pulls the rug out from under the need to wait for a future salvation mediated by the church. If the kingdom is here and now, if divinity is instantly accessible through inner knowledge, then those promises of future salvation lose their grip, their power to control the faithful. The Gospel of Thomas also drops a radical take on the very nature of Jesus himself. While the canonical Gospels paint Jesus as the only Son of God, the sole mediator between humanity and the divine, the Gospel of Thomas suggests we all have the potential to hit the same level of knowledge and union with the divine that Jesus did. The text implies Jesus isn't some unique, one-off divine being, but rather represents the spiritual potential lurking inside every human. This democratization of divinity was deeply subversive for an institution that built its entire authority on exclusive access to the sacred. If anyone could reach the same level of enlightenment as Jesus, then priestly mediation became obsolete. And with that, it was practically game over for the entire power structure the church had started building. The sayings in the Gospel of Thomas also reveal a totally different understanding of evil and suffering. While traditional Christianity hammers home original sin and the need for external redemption, this gospel suggests ignorance, more than sin, is the real root of human suffering. Salvation isn't about Christ's sacrifice, it's about directly knowing our true divine nature. This Gnostic take on evil as ignorance instead of moral sin radically transforms spiritual responsibility. Instead of relying on divine grace handed down through church sacraments, the individual becomes the architect of their own salvation by waking up to inner knowledge. This perspective doesn't just cut out the need for priestly go-betweens. It shakes the whole system of guilt and redemption that later became central to ecclesiastical control. The Gospel of Thomas also pitches a completely different view on the importance of scriptures and oral tradition. While institutional Christianity would eventually lock itself into strict reliance on authorized texts and their official interpretations, this gospel pushes for direct, personal experience of the divine. Jesus' sayings in the text frequently point inward, toward the immediate experience of the divine kingdom, rather than outward to external doctrines or ritual practices. This prioritizing of personal experience over doctrinal authority was an existential threat to any organized religious system that relied on controlling information and interpretation. The very structure of the Gospel of Thomas, just a collection of loose sayings without a connecting narrative, hints at a different understanding of how spiritual revelation works. Instead of a linear story with progressive lessons demanding expert interpretation, these sayings are designed to spark direct aha moments in the reader or listener. Each saying acts like a seed for contemplation, ready to sprout into spiritual understanding without any external mediation. This spiritual teaching methodology, centered on direct experience rather than systematic doctrine, was inherently at odds with the model of ecclesiastical authority emerging in Christianity's early centuries. Comparative studies between communities that use the Gospel of Thomas and those that stuck to the canonical Gospels reveal fundamental differences in their social and spiritual organization. Gnostic communities tied to texts like Thomas tended to be more egalitarian, with less formal hierarchy and a bigger emphasis on each member's personal spiritual experience. In contrast, communities following the canonical Gospels quickly developed more formal, hierarchical structures, with clearly defined roles for clergy and laity. This divide in community organization mirrored the fundamental theological differences between these early Christian approaches. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas and similar texts wasn't just about doctrinal purity. It was a practical necessity for the survival of the institutional structure the church was building. A Christianity based on direct divine experience, immediate inner knowledge, and fundamental spiritual equality for all individuals was simply incompatible with a system that relied on clerical authority, institutionally controlled sacraments, and priestly mediation. The choice between these approaches wasn't just theological, it was deeply political and social, hitting the bottom line of power. The implications of this suppression go way beyond just losing some old texts. Wiping out the Gnostic perspective from early Christianity meant losing a spiritual tradition that championed personal responsibility, direct experience of the divine, and understanding the kingdom of God as a present, accessible reality. Instead, institutional Christianity pushed a spirituality of dependence, external mediation, and future hope, elements that, while offering comfort and social structure, also made it way easier for the institution to control religious experience. The rediscovery of the Gospel of Thomas in the 20th century, especially its inclusion in that Nag Hammadi library found in 45, has allowed modern scholars to piece together a much fuller picture of early Christianity. This reconstruction reveals that what we know as Orthodox Christianity wasn't the only game in town, nor necessarily the most original way to interpret Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of Thomas suggests an alternative, possibly older, understanding existed, one that highlighted aspects of Jesus' teachings that were later downplayed or flat-out eliminated for both theological and practical reasons. The historical authenticity of the Gospel of Thomas as a record of Jesus' earliest teachings is still a hot topic in academic circles. Some researchers hint that certain sayings in the text might preserve oral traditions that are just as old, or even older, than the sources used in the canonical Gospels. This possibility raises some deep questions about the nature of Christian tradition and what elements of Jesus' original teachings might have gotten lost in the shuffle of Christianity's institutionalization. The investigation will keep on revealing the complexities of this fascinating window into early Christianity and what it means for how we understand Jesus' original message. The war to define the real nature of Christianity didn't end with the official suppression of texts like the Gospel of Thomas. For centuries, church authorities cooked up increasingly sophisticated strategies to wipe out not just the physical documents, but also the ideas and practices they represented. The persecution of Gnostic groups ramped up, especially during the 3rd and 4th centuries, hitting right when Christian power was solidifying under the Roman Empire. This systematic campaign of elimination wasn't just about burning books. It included actively hunting down teachers, infiltrating alternative communities, and crafting narratives that painted these traditions as heretical and a danger to your very soul. The methods used to squash these alternative viewpoints show just how sophisticated the institutional strategy was. Church authorities didn't just ban these texts. They churned out distorted versions of their teachings, presenting them as caricatures to make them seem absurd or blasphemous. This straw man tactic allowed the official church to refute simplified versions of Gnostic teachings without ever really confronting their deeper, more compelling arguments. At the same time, Orthodox interpretations were heavily promoted, backed by the full weight of imperial power and the emerging institutional authority. The reshaping of the Christian message during this critical period involved fundamental shifts in how key concepts, found in both the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical texts, were understood. The notion of the kingdom of God, which in the Gospel of Thomas is presented as a present reality accessible through inner understanding, was gradually reinterpreted as a future promise, conditional on institutional obedience. This rejiggering wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate decisions made by church leaders who totally grasped the political and social implications of every single interpretation. The canonization process for Christian scriptures, which wrapped up in various church councils, stands as one of the most significant exercises in editorial control in religious history. The criteria for deciding which texts made it into the official canon weren't just about historical authenticity or spiritual merit. They were also about how well those texts fit with the institutional structure being built. Texts that pushed for direct experience of the divine, like the Gospel of Thomas, were systematically cut, not necessarily because they were less authentic, but because they posed a direct threat to the mediating authority the institutional church was consolidating. The fallout from these decisions stretched way beyond just the religious realm. Wiping out traditions that emphasized spiritual equality and direct divine experience had deep implications for the development of Western culture. Promoting a spirituality based on external authority and institutional mediation helped forge thought patterns that valued obedience over personal inquiry, conformity over individual experience, and institutional dependence over personal responsibility in spiritual matters. It created a domino effect that shaped how we think even today. The accidental preservation of the Gospel of Thomas and other Gnostic texts in the Nag Hammadi library gives us a peek behind the curtain at what got lost during this process of doctrinal homogenization. These texts reveal a diversity of early Christian thought that's surprisingly rich and sophisticated, suggesting that alternatives to Orthodox Christianity weren't just heretical deviations. They were legitimate traditions, complete with their own internal logic and spiritual depth. Modern research into these texts has also unearthed early Christian communities that operated with organizational structures radically different from the ones that eventually won out. Some of these communities featured prominent female leadership, spiritual practices rooted in direct experience, and theological approaches that stressed immediate personal transformation instead of future salvation. Suppressing these alternatives didn't just eliminate texts. It wiped out entire forms of community organization and spiritual practice that could have significantly enriched the development of Christianity. Careful analysis of the sayings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas reveals teachings that, in many cases, seem more consistent with the first-century Jewish context than some of the interpretations that later became orthodox. This suggests the possibility that certain Gnostic traditions actually preserved elements of Jesus' original teachings that were later modified or scrubbed to serve institutional agendas. That possibility raises some seriously uncomfortable questions about the link between historical authenticity and doctrinal orthodoxy in the evolution of Christianity. The resilience of these alternative traditions against official suppression is also pretty remarkable. Despite centuries of systematic persecution, elements of the Gnostic perspective kept popping up in marginal Christian movements throughout history. From the medieval Cathars to various mystical movements, the drive to seek direct divine experience and to question institutional mediation persisted like an underground current within the broader Christian tradition. This persistence suggests these ideas tapped into genuine spiritual needs that weren't fully met by official orthodoxy. The archaeological and textual evidence that surfaced over the last 70-plus years has completely revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity, dropping a radically different perspective on Jesus' original teachings. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945 was a watershed moment in historical research, but this was just the beginning of a series of findings that have continued to challenge traditional narratives about the origins of Christianity. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered around the same period, revealed the existence of first-century Jewish communities with practices and beliefs that showed striking similarities to elements that would later appear in Gnostic texts like the Gospel of Thomas. Recent paleographic studies have demonstrated that many Gnostic texts preserve traditions traceable to the earliest years of the Christian movement, possibly even to the decades immediately following Jesus' crucifixion. Linguistic analysis of the Gospel of Thomas, in particular, has uncovered underlying Aramaic structures, suggesting that many of its sayings were originally formulated in Jesus' native language, providing a direct connection to the actual words he might have spoken. This linguistic evidence is particularly significant because Aramaic was the everyday language of first-century Palestine, and Aramaic formulations in later texts often indicate a very ancient oral tradition. Comparative research between the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas and the canonical Gospels has yielded fascinating results that challenge many assumptions about the development of the evangelical tradition. In several instances, the versions of Jesus' sayings preserved in Thomas appear more primitive and less theologically developed than the versions found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This suggests that Thomas might have preserved earlier forms of these teachings before they were modified to serve the specific doctrinal purposes of the communities that produced the canonical Gospels. The absence of narrative and the exclusive focus on sayings also suggests that Thomas reflects a type of early Christian tradition centered on Jesus' words as a wisdom teacher, rather than his role as a soteriological figure. Papyri discovered at Oxyrhynchus in the early 20th century, which contain fragments of the Gospel of Thomas in Greek, have provided additional evidence of this text's antiquity and wide circulation. These fragments, dating from the 2nd or 3rd century, demonstrate that the Gospel of Thomas was not a marginal or sectarian text, but rather circulated extensively among early Christian communities. The existence of both Greek and Coptic versions suggests that this gospel was considered important enough to be translated and preserved in multiple languages, indicating its significance within early Christian traditions. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with early Christian communities have unearthed material evidence supporting the existence of diverse Christian traditions in the first few centuries. Discoveries at sites like Dura Europos have shown early Christian worship spaces that incorporated symbolism and practices later associated with Gnostic traditions. These findings suggest that the diversity of early Christian thought wasn't merely a matter of texts and doctrines. It was reflected in concrete community practices and artistic expressions. The presence of these elements in verifiable archaeological contexts provides tangible evidence that alternative perspectives on Jesus' teachings weren't later aberrations but an integral part of the early Christian landscape. Studies on textual transmission have also revealed intriguing patterns in how different Christian traditions preserved and modified Jesus' teachings. Analysis of textual variants in ancient manuscripts shows that copyists often altered texts to conform to the prevailing doctrines of their specific communities. However, texts like the Gospel of Thomas, preserved in contexts where there was no pressure to conform to emerging orthodoxy, maintained formulations that appear to reflect older, less doctrinally developed perspectives. This accidental preservation of alternative traditions offers a unique window into early Christian thought before it was shaped by later doctrinal controversies. Research into the practices of early Gnostic communities has also unveiled fascinating aspects of how these teachings were lived and applied in community settings. Texts preserved at Nag Hammadi include not only alternative gospels, but also manuals of spiritual practice, sophisticated theological treatises, and texts describing mystical experiences. This textual diversity suggests that the communities preserving the Gospel of Thomas weren't merely groups of speculative intellectuals, but vibrant communities with developed spiritual traditions and coherent communal practices. The sophistication of these texts also indicates that these communities included individuals with advanced education and considerable theological capabilities. Comparative studies between Gnostic Christianity and other wisdom traditions of the ancient world have revealed surprising connections that illuminate the broader intellectual context in which these teachings developed. Similarities between certain aspects of Gnostic thought and philosophical traditions like Middle Platonism, Hermeticism, and even elements of Buddhist philosophy suggest that these alternative Christian traditions were engaged in a wider intellectual dialogue than what characterized the Mediterranean culture of the Hellenistic period. This intellectual openness contrasts sharply with the doctrinal isolation that later characterized Orthodox Christianity, suggesting that the suppression of Gnostic traditions also represented a significant loss of cultural and intellectual exchange. Papyrological evidence has also provided insights into the daily life of the communities that preserved these alternative texts. Personal documents, contracts, and correspondence found in archaeological contexts associated with Gnostic communities reveal societies that functioned in notably different ways from contemporary Orthodox Christian communities. These documents suggest higher levels of female participation in leadership roles, economic practices that emphasized communal cooperation, and social structures that valued individual spiritual experience over doctrinal conformity. The preservation of this material evidence provides independent confirmation of the differences between these communities and the forms of Christianity that ultimately prevailed. The transformation of the early Christian message didn't happen in isolation. It was deeply intertwined with the political and social changes of the Roman Empire during the 3rd and 4th centuries. When Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan, it not only changed the religion's legal status, but inadvertently accelerated a process of institutionalization that favored certain interpretations over others. Christian communities that had operated underground during earlier persecutions suddenly found themselves competing for official recognition and imperial support. In this new political context, traditions that could present themselves in a more unified and doctrinally coherent manner had significant advantages over those that emphasized the diversity of individual spiritual experiences. The Gospel of Thomas and its associated traditions represented an approach to Christianity that didn't easily adapt to the demands of an imperial religion. Its emphasis on direct knowledge of the divine, the authority of personal experience, and individual interpretation of Jesus' teachings fundamentally clashed with the need to create uniform hierarchical structures that could administer a religion on an imperial scale. Leaders of the emerging church recognized that the survival and growth of their movement depended on their ability to present a unified front to imperial authorities and to develop administrative systems that could function consistently across vast geographical territories. Historical research has revealed that the process of canonization of sacred Christian texts was significantly influenced by these political and administrative considerations. Texts included in the official biblical canon weren't selected solely based on theological criteria or historical antiquity, but also on their utility in supporting the institutional structures the church was developing. The Gospel of Thomas, with its collection of sayings requiring individual interpretation and its lack of clear historical narrative, didn't provide the kind of doctrinal foundation that ecclesiastical leaders needed to establish uniform institutional authority. Historical documents from the period show intense and prolonged debates over which texts should be considered authentically Christian. These debates weren't limited to abstract considerations of theological orthodoxy, but involved practical questions about how to build and maintain a coherent religious institution. Texts that emphasized episcopal authority, the importance of doctrinal unity, and the need to adhere to established teachings were favored over those that promoted independent spiritual exploration or suggested that divine truth could be accessed directly without institutional intermediation. Archaeological evidence from 4th century Christian sites shows a dramatic transformation in religious architecture and art that reflects these broader doctrinal shifts. Churches built after Christianity's imperial recognition display designs emphasizing clerical hierarchy and the passive participation of ordinary believers, contrasting sharply with the more intimate and participatory gathering spaces that characterized earlier Christian communities. This material evidence suggests that the suppression of traditions like those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas was part of a broader reorganization of Christian practice aimed at creating forms of worship and community compatible with the demands of an imperial religion. Studies of the patristic literature of the period also reveal how church leaders developed sophisticated arguments to justify the exclusion of alternative texts. These arguments often focused less on the specific content of texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, and more on questions of apostolic authority and historical transmission. However, modern textual analysis has demonstrated that many of these arguments were based on questionable historical premises and often reflected contemporary institutional needs, more than objective evaluations of the text's antiquity or authenticity. The transformation of Christianity during this period also involved significant changes in the understanding of Jesus' nature itself. While the Gospel of Thomas presents Jesus primarily as a wisdom teacher whose teachings point to truths individuals can discover for themselves, doctrinal formulations that emerged during the 4th and 5th centuries increasingly emphasized Jesus' unique and exclusive nature as a divine mediator. This doctrinal evolution had the practical effect of centralizing religious authority in the institutions that claimed to represent Jesus, reducing the importance of the direct spiritual experience central to traditions like those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas. Manuscripts preserving theological debates from the period show that these transformations didn't occur without significant resistance. Many Christian communities maintained traditions that emphasized aspects of Jesus' teachings resonating more directly with the spirit of the Gospel of Thomas, and there were continuous attempts to preserve and transmit these alternative perspectives. However, communities holding these traditions faced increasing pressure from both imperial authorities and the emerging ecclesiastical hierarchy, ultimately leading to their marginalization or suppression. Documentary evidence also suggests that the process of marginalizing alternative traditions had consequences far beyond purely theological matters. Communities that had developed spiritual practices based on teachings like those in the Gospel of Thomas had often also created innovative social structures that included greater female participation, more egalitarian approaches to community authority, and economic practices emphasizing cooperation over individual accumulation. The suppression of these spiritual traditions also represented the loss of alternative social experiments that might have contributed to the development of more inclusive and participatory forms of community organization. Analysis of archaeological and documentary evidence that has emerged over the last few decades has provided a revolutionary perspective on the diversity of early Christianity and the position the Gospel of Thomas held within this complex landscape. Discoveries at sites like Nag Hammadi have revealed a much richer and more varied textual tradition than official sources had preserved, suggesting that the canonization process wasn't simply a matter of identifying the most authentic or ancient texts, but involved complex decisions influenced by political, social, and theological factors, often having little to do with fidelity to Jesus' original teachings. Research on Coptic manuscripts has shown that the Gospel of Thomas circulated widely in Christian communities that maintained distinctive spiritual practices, many of which emphasized the direct experience of the kingdom of heaven as something accessible in the present moment. This perspective contrasted sharply with interpretations developing in ecclesiastical power centers, where emphasis was increasingly placed on institutional mediation of salvation and the hope of future rewards. Paleographic studies have established that some of these manuscripts date from very early periods, suggesting that the traditions preserved in the Gospel of Thomas weren't late developments or heretical deviations, but represented authentic currents of early Christian thought that had maintained their vitality in specific communities. Linguistic analyses have provided particularly convincing evidence regarding the antiquity and authenticity of many of the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas. Investigations into the Aramaic elements present in the Greek text have suggested that many of the sayings attributed to Jesus in this Gospel preserve linguistic characteristics consistent with the first-century Palestinian environment. This linguistic evidence has led some specialists to propose that certain versions of these sayings might be closer to Jesus' original words than the versions appearing in the canonical Gospels, where the process of translation and adaptation for Gentile audiences may have modified important aspects of the original message. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with early Christian communities have also revealed material evidence supporting the existence of alternative spiritual traditions. Artifacts found at these sites include ritual objects, inscriptions, and architectural elements suggesting community practices that differed significantly from those that developed in later institutional churches. These archaeological findings have provided a material context for understanding how teachings of the type preserved in the Gospel of Thomas translated into concrete practices of community life and spiritual expression. Studies of papyri and other written materials from the period have revealed a complex network of textual exchange connecting Christian communities from Egypt to Syria and beyond. This network of textual communication suggests that spiritual ideas and practices circulated much more freely than later official narratives have suggested, and that there was a considerable level of experimentation and diversity in interpreting Jesus' teachings. The Gospel of Thomas appears to have been an important component of this textual exchange, with evidence of its influence on a variety of spiritual traditions spanning wide geographical regions. Administrative documents from the Roman Empire of the period have also provided important insights into the political context in which these alternative traditions developed. These documents reveal that imperial authorities were genuinely concerned about the social and political implications of the diverse forms of Christianity, and that there was a clear understanding that different interpretations of Jesus' teachings could lead to very different forms of social and political organization. Traditions associated with texts like the Gospel of Thomas were perceived as particularly problematic because their emphasis on direct spiritual experience and the fundamental equality of all spiritual seekers tended to undermine traditional hierarchies of authority. Letters and other personal documents that have survived from the period also provide poignant testimonies about the personal impact these alternative traditions had on individuals' lives. These documents reveal communities of spiritual practice that had found in teachings like those of the Gospel of Thomas a source of profound personal transformation and hope amidst difficult social and political circumstances. Descriptions of spiritual experiences in these personal documents often resonate directly with the teachings about the present kingdom of heaven that are central to the Gospel of Thomas, suggesting that these ideas weren't merely abstract theological speculations but translated into lived experiences of spiritual transformation. Records of formal and informal theological debates from the period have also preserved detailed arguments about the differences between interpretations of Jesus' message. These debates reveal that proponents of traditions like those preserved in the Gospel of Thomas had sophisticated and well-reasoned arguments for their perspectives, and that the issues in dispute weren't simple misunderstandings, but reflected fundamental differences about the nature of spirituality. The arguments preserved in these documents lay it bare. Alternative traditions weren't shoved aside because they were intellectually flimsy or historically shaky. Nope. They got pushed out because they presented a vision of Christianity that simply didn't jibe with the political and social goals of the burgeoning ecclesiastical power structure. Power and politics, they were the real architects, shaping what ultimately got stamped Orthodox Christianity. You can't get your head around why texts like the Gospel of Thomas got sidelined without staring those factors down. The hookup between the Christian Church and Roman imperial power back in the 4th century, that was the game changer, setting up a system where interpretations of Christianity that buttressed hierarchical authority were systematically favored over those championing direct spiritual experience and the fundamental equality of all seekers. The administrative paperwork from that era shows imperial bigwigs had a crystal-clear grip on the political implications of different Christian flavors. They made conscious calls on which traditions to back and which to squash. The stuff tied to the Gospel of Thomas, that was seen as a real headache, mainly because its whole vibe, this idea that every individual could tap directly into divine wisdom, it undercut the need for institutional middlemen. And that, my friends, questioned the very foundation of both religious and political authority. The shakeup of ecclesiastical power structures back then also meant a major shift in how spiritual leadership was even understood. While the traditions in the Gospel of Thomas hinted that real spiritual authority sprang from direct experience and personal realization, the church institutions consolidating in the 4th and 5th centuries built their authority on apostolic succession, formal ordination, and sticking to specific doctrinal blueprints. This wasn't just a tweak, it was a seismic shift in how spiritual wisdom got passed down and validated. Records from the church councils of the era prove these changes weren't some smooth operation. There was serious debate, plenty of pushback. Lots of religious leaders voiced their worries about the direction Christianity's institutionalization was heading. Folks kept trying to carve out space for perspectives that championed direct spiritual experience. But, in the end, the political muscle and the sheer need to forge a religion that could effectively bind the empire together ultimately iced those alternative voices out. The paper trail also suggests that decisions about what texts made it into the biblical canon were heavily swayed by how those texts could prop up the emerging institutional structures. Texts that hammered home the authority of church leaders, the critical nature of correct doctrine, and the demand for institutional unity, those got the green light. The ones suggesting individuals could tap directly into spiritual truth, not so much. The Gospel of Thomas, with its focus on individual responsibility for the spiritual quest and its total silence on church hierarchies, became a square peg in a round hole for those institutional goals. Studies delving into the political economy of institutional Christianity from that era have also blown the lid off how material interests elbowed their way into these processes. Churches setting themselves up as permanent fixtures needed stable financial backing, clear property structures, and solid mechanisms for passing down authority. Spiritual traditions that preached detachment from material possessions and the fundamental equality of all participants, those were inherently at odds with these institutional demands. The sidelining of texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, can partly be chalked up to these practical clashes between differing blueprints for religious organization. But when you really dig into what the sources actually say, reading them with a careful eye, unfiltered by centuries of institutional dogma, a picture of Jesus' message emerges that's way more complex, more nuanced than the watered-down versions that have dominated traditional Christianity. The Gospel of Thomas, when you read it in its original context and stack it up against other early sources, lays out teachings deeply rooted in Jewish wisdom tradition. It hammers home personal transformation through direct understanding, not just signing off on creeds or going through specific rituals. The teachings in the Gospel of Thomas suggest Jesus saw his gig primarily as a teacher, pointing folks toward truths they could uncover themselves, rather than some singular mediator whose special status was essential for everyone else's salvation. This take aligns with wisdom traditions that stressed humanity's capacity for spiritual growth and direct realization, hinting at a fundamentally democratic and inclusive understanding of spirituality. The sayings attributed to Jesus in this text also shine a light on a sophisticated grasp of spiritual psychology and the internal roadblocks that keep us from recognizing spiritual truths. A lot of these teachings act like an open invite to self-exploration, to questioning our basic assumptions about reality. They suggest that real spiritual work is about a fundamental shift in perception, not just signing on the dotted line for a particular set of beliefs. This approach jives with contemplative traditions found across countless spiritual cultures, suggesting Jesus' original teachings might have had more in common with these universal paths than later institutional interpretations ever let on. A careful deep dive into the text also reveals that a lot of the Gospel of Thomas's teachings are specifically geared toward dismantling our human tendencies to build spiritual hierarchies and lean on outside authorities. The sayings that talk about the kingdom of heaven being both inside and outside individuals suggest a spiritual understanding that blows past the divides between sacred and secular, spiritual and mundane. This integrated outlook stands in stark contrast to the dualistic divisions that took root in much of later institutional Christianity. The references in the Gospel of Thomas to becoming like children seem to point toward reclaiming that sense of wonder, curiosity, and openness that defines a child's awareness. This teaching suggests spiritual work involves a process of unlearning the social and conceptual conditioning that clouds our direct perception of reality. This outlook is strikingly similar to approaches found in contemplative traditions across numerous cultures, suggesting Jesus' teachings might have been aimed at universal experiences of spiritual transformation, rather than just cooking up a specific religion with its own particular beliefs and practices. The teachings on unity popping up in the Gospel of Thomas uncover a deep mystical understanding that blasts past ordinary conceptual divisions. They suggest spiritual realization means recognizing a fundamental connectivity that exists far beyond the surface-level illusions of separation. This mystical perspective jives with advanced contemplative traditions and hints that Jesus' original teachings might have been geared toward levels of spiritual realization that blow way past the moral and doctrinal interpretations that have held sway in institutional Christianity. When you try to square away the different perspectives that pop up from a careful study of sources like the Gospel of Thomas with the traditions that have fleshed out in institutional Christianity, it becomes clear that a lot of the friction isn't irreconcilable. Not if you get that different teachings might have been aimed at different levels of spiritual readiness and different practical situations. The teachings pushing direct experience and personal realization, those could have been for folks ready for advanced spiritual practice. Meanwhile, the teachings stressing faith, obedience, and community involvement, those might have been for those just starting out on their spiritual journey. This outlook suggests the friction between different Christian traditions could actually get smoothed over by recognizing that Jesus' message was rich and multifaceted enough to pack in teachings suitable for a huge variety of spiritual temperaments and readiness levels. The real trouble starts when any one set of teachings gets paraded as the whole message, elbowing out other perspectives that might be just as valid and valuable for different people in different situations. The Gospel of Thomas, from this angle, doesn't need to be seen as some radical alternative to traditional Christianity. Instead, think of it as a preservation of aspects of the original message that got downplayed or outright lost in the institutionalization shuffle. Integrating these perspectives could lead to a fuller, more nuanced grasp of Jesus' teachings, one that honors the importance of both community and tradition, as well as the need for direct spiritual experience and personal growth. The fallout from this synthesis stretches way beyond purely theological debates, hitting fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority, the role of religious institutions, and the interplay between individual faith and communal practice. An understanding that brings in the Gospel of Thomas's perspectives suggests the healthiest religious institutions would be those that facilitate direct spiritual experience, instead of claiming exclusive ownership over it. Ones that honor each individual's capacity for spiritual growth, while still providing the community support and traditional wisdom that can nurture that growth. This reconciling vision also hints that the differences between spiritual traditions could be seen as reflections of the sheer richness and complexity of human experience, rather than some irreconcilable divides. The teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas, when understood in this light, offer valuable tools for folks looking to deepen their spiritual understanding, no matter their particular religious affiliations. The emphasis on direct experience, self-inquiry, and personal transformation that defines this text can complement and enrich a whole lot of different spiritual practices. The discovery and study of the Gospel of Thomas isn't just some dusty old archaeological find or academic curiosity. It's a golden opportunity to reevaluate fundamental aspects of the Christian message that have been obscured by centuries of institutional spin. The teachings in this text suggest Jesus' original message might have been more radical, more transformative, and way more universally applicable than the institutional versions ever let on. The invitation here is for a form of spirituality that honors both the depth of tradition and the pressing need for direct personal experience. For those who've hit a wall with traditional forms of Christianity, the Gospel of Thomas offers up some serious resources for a deeper, more personal grasp of spiritual teachings. For those who dig Christian tradition but are looking to supercharge their practice, this text points to directions that can complement and enrich traditional participation. And for those hunting for spiritual understanding outside the usual religious frameworks, the teachings in the Gospel of Thomas lay out universal principles relevant to any honest-to-goodness quest for spiritual growth and personal transformation. The real punch of the Gospel of Thomas might not be in its power to contradict or replace other spiritual traditions. Nah. Its true weight lies in its ability to remind us of aspects of the spiritual message that get easily lost in the grind of institutionalization. Its focus on direct experience, personal transformation, and our human capacity for spiritual realization offers a vital counterweight to the pull toward institutional dependence and external authority that can often define organized religions. At the same time, its preservation of teachings that point to universal truths suggests that the spiritual message blasts past sectarian divides and speaks to fundamental human needs shared across cultures and eras. Diving into the Gospel of Thomas ultimately calls on us to rethink our assumptions about the nature of spiritual authority, the role of religious institutions, and the handshake between tradition and personal experience. The teachings in this text suggest that true spirituality involves a delicate balancing act between respecting inherited wisdom and being willing to dig for truths ourselves. This balanced outlook can offer invaluable tools for navigating the complexities of spiritual life in a world still wrestling with fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, and the nature of human fulfillment. Thanks for sticking with me to the end. Catch you on the next one.